Hello, and thank you for tuning into my virtual workshop, Best Practices on Practice. My name is Michaela Kelly, and I am an assistant professor of voice at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Thank you to the Mid-Atlantic region of NATS for giving me this opportunity to share with you all at this year's conference. Today is all about practice. I first became interested in practice because I was curious about how singers learn most effectively. It was not until my graduate studies with the guidance of my teacher that I truly learned how to structure, evaluate, and self-reflect on the quality of my practice. It is in individual practice that singers learn repertoire and build technique. If practice in between lessons is not specific, deliberate, and effective, the next lesson will likely not be as fruitful, potentially leading to frustration from both the student and teacher. It is my goal as a teacher to teach students how to practice so that they can learn to curate and love their own process of learning and practicing on their own, which will lead them to greater student autonomy. This will create more space in the lesson for expression, skill transfer, collaboration, and diving more deeply into the music-making process. I hope this workshop can offer a new perspective, idea, or tool for implementation in your studio. The plan for today's workshop is to define practice and some related terms, then move into reflections on practice for both the teacher and the student. We will then move into examples of effective methods and prescriptions for practice that can be implemented in your studio. I will then leave you with 10 quick tips for practice before closing with a bibliography and my contact information. Let's get started. In 2008, Malcolm Gladwell introduced his 10,000-hour rule in his book, Outliers. Gladwell describes this 10,000 hours idea as, quote, "The rule says to be world-class at anything, you have to put in 10,000 hours of practice." This quote and idea has circulated widely since its publication, but what does this quote really mean? Defining what Gladwell means by practice is important. The caveat is that if the 10,000 hours are not spent practicing deliberately with a target or goal in mind, the result will be far from world-class. My definition of practice is as follows: to perform a specific skill that could not be completed or at the beginning of the practice session, or reinforces a prior established technical or expressive goal. The key ideas being specific, where attention will be active rather than passive, progress towards a new learning target or skill over the time of the practice session, and repetition to reinforce coordination between the mind and body. Lastly, the word perform implies that the student is actively doing something during their practice process. Now, learning is divided into two different modes, declarative and procedural learning. Declarative learning deals with the process of storing facts or pieces of information. Procedural learning refers to the acquisition of motor tasks or skills through repetition. In other words, declarative learning is to know, and procedural learning is to do. As singers and teachers of singers, we can acquire lots of information on how to sing, but this does not lead to building the skills of singing. We must actually sing to grow as singers. Therefore, motor learning is a set of internal processes associated with practice or experience, leading to relatively permanent gains in the capability for skilled performance. In accordance with this definition by researchers Schmidt and Lee, voice training falls under the realm of procedural or motor learning. Singing is a complex motor task where learning relies on doing rather than knowing or talking about how to sing. We need to prioritize the doing within the lesson to ensure that students attempt the target motor skill within the lesson so that they can receive feedback on how to practice outside of the lesson. Motor learning requires experience or practice doing the skill. The practice regimen for athletes often looks different from musicians. While football players and singers can both be considered as athletes, the training for each looks almost the opposite from each other. Hypothetically, a football player and a singer may spend 10 total hours a week practicing. An example of weekly practice for a football player could be 8 hours of supervised practice with a coach who will provide feedback on their running, throwing, and passing. That remaining 2 hours could then be spent at home practicing alone. In talking with athletes that have practiced at the high school and collegiate level, they've shared that the number of hours practicing under the supervision of a coach is likely higher than 8. The football player can then implement the feedback from their work with the coach in their 2 hours of individual practice at home. Singers, on the other hand, typically only receive an hour lesson with their teacher per week. Some receive half an hour or 45-minute lessons. The remaining practice time is done individually. As a teacher, it is clear to me that the lesson should be a template for the student's practice, and I'm puzzled often when students don't understand or apply that concept. Perhaps it's because without a teacher there to lead them through the steps of the lesson, they are unable to replicate the lesson on their own. If teachers were to discuss practice strategies and assign prescriptions for practice, we might be able to help students move towards a deliberate practice regimen. Ericsson, the author of Peak Secrets from the New Science of Expertise, describe deliberate practice differently from purposeful practice in the following ways. First, it requires a feel that is already reasonably developed, which singing is. Secondly, deliberate practice requires a teacher who can provide practice activities designed to help a student improve their performance. Teachers are an integral part of deliberate practice as they are skilled in the field in which the students want to learn, and it is the teacher's responsibility to educate their students on practice strategies or activities designed to improve performance. In my 2024 research study, which observed 10 different student-teacher pairs, I found that the students in these lessons were singing on average 25% of the total lesson time. If 75% of these lessons were filled with teachers modeling, providing verbal instructions or feedback, instead of the student actually singing, the student is walking away from their lesson with information rather than action to put into their practice. If a student is unable to sing within their lesson where they can be observed and given feedback, it will be difficult for them to practice independently between lessons. Now we will move into part 1 of honest practice reflections, the first being from the teacher perspective. First, do you ask your students about their practice every lesson? Is it something that you discuss at the beginning of the lesson, at the end? Do you speak about it when you first meet a student? Do you only speak about it when you perhaps suspect that practice is not as efficient? Secondly, what is your expectation of student practice between lessons? Do you expect a certain number of days in the week, a certain amount of hours? Do you expect them to warm up every lesson? Do you expect them to practice on a day when they have other rehearsals? Do you expect them to practice immediately before or after your lesson? And then how do you communicate or adjust these expectations depending on the individual student? Are these expectations written down in your studio, in a studio policy like a syllabus? Is it orally communicated? Is it written somewhere where they can go back and reference? And then, is there room to adjust or edit these expectations depending on the individual student? Say the student cannot meet your expectation. Are you willing to edit or work with the student to find an expectation that you can both compromise and agree on? Do you prescribe specific practice activities? Do you explicitly let the students know what warm-ups they should be implementing in their practice and what the goal of those warm-ups are? Do you assign specific sections or measures of their repertoire for them to focus on with a specific target or goal that they should be paying attention to in that specific piece of repertoire? And lastly, how do you evaluate if a student practiced effectively? Do you evaluate through a conversation where they share their experiences on practice? Do they write about it? Do you look for evidence within their performance in the lesson to evaluate if practice was done efficiently? What systems of evaluation do you have to evaluate student practice? And as we move into part 2 of Honest Practice Reflections, I would suggest that these questions or conversation prompts be implemented in a variety of ways. The first being in an oral discussion forum, particularly when working with new students. The questions can illuminate the student's prior experience or conception of practice, which can then frame your work going forward. Secondly, the prompts can be used for practice journals. It's more to come later. And thirdly, they could be printed or posted in the studio as a reminder of intentional, deliberate practice. Now, some questions for students. How often do you practice? How many days of the week do you practice? Do you have a target amount of days? Does it change depending on your schedule? Do you schedule your practice? What organization system do you have? Do you put it in your calendar like a class? Secondly, how long do you practice for? Do you structure your practice so that you're practicing multiple times in the day? Is it a larger chunk of time in your schedule? Do you give yourself a limit on how long you're practicing for? Do you take a break in the middle of your practice? Third, how do you structure your practice? Do you warm up every time that you practice? If you're coming straight from an ensemble or a lesson, how does that affect your practice structure? Do you always do the same warm-ups? Do you move through the same repertoire in the same order each time? Do you work in order from beginning to end in each piece? Next, did someone teach you how to practice? I do find as a teacher, a lot of my students that are moving into the individual voice lesson space for the first time often have been a singer in an ensemble, that the teacher moves them through a warm-up and a structure of a rehearsal where that they are being led and someone is telling them exactly what to do. And I find that exactly in our individual voice studio lessons as well. And even as the teacher that assumes that they can move themselves through that process, the transfer of skill and process that they are supposed to replicate in their own practice does not always happen. So talking about what conceptions do they have about practice and what that should look like based on their prior experience, and did someone explicitly teach them how to practice? And then lastly, for the student, how do you evaluate your practice session? Are there certain check marks that you're trying to establish that you've accomplished by the end of a practice session? Is it a time target? Is it a day target based on length of time? What are your yardsticks in evaluating your practice session? So there are some truths about practice. Practicing passively and checking a box to fulfill a time requirement will not lead to growth that can be reliably retrieved over time. And that is really what we're aiming to do as practice. When we're learning a piece, we're looking to perform it at a recital, a jury, a show that is coming up in months or perhaps even a year later. Learning and practicing now is in service of retention later. So first truth, attention is short, fallible, and can be hard to attain. However, it is the product of specificity. Entering practice with a specific goal, measure numbers, or a time limit can help the brain stay active and attentive throughout the practice session. Second truth, multitasking doesn't work, particularly multi-screen multitasking, where multiple devices or screens are active at the same time. This can be difficult with a lot of students and teachers converting to scores on a device such as an iPad. However, turning notifications off or turning on Do Not Disturb or airplane mode can help fight the urge to check a notification. The best solution is to turn a device off completely. The third truth is quality of time spent practicing is more important than the quantity of time. Practicing a phrase with incorrect melody, rhythm, diction, and technique will reinforce the wrong way to sing the phrase. Unlearning or attempting to undo this becomes harder and takes more time overall. Attention and self-awareness can help combat passive practice to ensure that the repetitions in practice are reinforcing the correct target skill or goal. For example, in a lesson, I will extract that problematic phrase and have the student sing through it. I will then ask a student if each element, melody, rhythm, diction, or a technical skill such as did you breathe in the right spots, did you breathe in the middle of the word, I move through these elements and ask if each was accurate, yes or no. If they say I don't know, I point out that perhaps they were not paying close attention. And we repeat the process until they can identify accurately themselves. Because if they're turning to me in the lesson to tell them what is accurate and incorrect, they will not be able to identify that on their own without an external person to let them know their accuracy or inaccuracy. And lastly, the trademark of learning is repeatability. Often I hear from students that 5 minutes ago in their practice room, they could sing the piece perfectly. They feel frustrated that all of a sudden they have forgotten words or a technical skill has become unstable. The unfortunate truth is learning is nonlinear and at times feels a bit random. When the brain and body have repeatedly coordinated over time at different times of the day, in different spaces, and setting a different acoustic, wearing different shoes and clothing, learning has truly occurred. Performing a song accurately one time is not an indicator of learning. Performance is an overall average of what occurs in practice. If the piece is performed accurately 1 out of 5 times, it will likely not be accurate in performance. We practice to raise our average to increase the likelihood that the technical skills and accuracy are available to us in performance. Discussing these concepts and truths with students can help frame the importance of practice and give explanations to the frustrations that they might be feeling. The goal is to provide students with tools to build a reliable practice process that leads to sustainable growth rather than a feeling of random successes and failures. So there are a few practice methods that I want to define. There's an idea of blocked and randomized practice in the literature. Blocked practice means that if we're singing something like Caro o mio ben, you work at measure 1 and you move to the end. Randomized practice suggests chunking the piece into different sections and learning them out of order. In other words, block practice is working from measure 1 to the end in a sequential way, and randomized practice is learning it out of order in a non-sequential way. So to define chunking is dividing a song into sections based on musical form. Also, bonus points, it's a great opportunity to talk to students about form and identifying the form of a song. So for example, one chunk could be verse 1, chunk 2 is the chorus, chunk 3, verse 2, and then chunk 4 is the bridge. And perhaps in a randomized practice form, you go straight to the bridge and you learn that part first, and then you go back and you learn the chorus, and then you learn verse 2, and then verse 1. In a research study that I conducted in 2022, I compared blocked and randomized practice methods and looked at accuracy over time. And blocked practice, the acquisition, the learning process occurs faster, meaning that if you start from the beginning and you work your way to the end, you will likely learn it faster. But I found in my study that the retention of that accuracy diminishes over time. However, randomized practice, learning those chunks out of order, perhaps working from the back or the hardest part of the piece first, and then jumping around as you learn different parts of the piece out of order, it takes longer during the learning acquisition process, but the retention is longer. Usually, students that I witness that you only use blocked practice and work from the beginning to the end start very strong, and as the piece moves on, the accuracy, the confidence, and the availability of that learned information diminishes as the song goes on. And typically, a lot of pieces get harder as they move on, or something changes at the end. There's a coda or a cadenza. And if a student works from the beginning to the end, and say they always start at the beginning, and at each time, say in the middle of the chorus or verse 2, they make a mistake and roll back to the beginning, they're getting a lot of experienced learning of the beginning of the song and very little experience of the end. So this idea of chunking and randomized practice helps combat this by going to those targeted difficult moments first, and then when you experience them at the end, it feels a little bit like coming home rather than a fear of I'm not sure what is going to come out because I haven't experienced this more difficult, unfamiliar part of the song. So implementing these practice methods and describing them, defining them to your students could help them structure their practice more effectively and efficiently. Some other practice methods. I have my students do an audio recording of each of their lessons so that they can write a weekly practice journal. So it is a written log with 2 parts. One is a lesson overview where they listen to their lesson, audio recording, and they describe what happened, what warm-ups we talked about, anything that we're talking about perhaps for a recital or a jury or an audition. And then the second part is the practice log, which happens before their next lesson, and it describes when they practiced, how much they practiced, did they have any questions that can help frame the next lesson. And it's a great place for me to check in with them and see if there's anything that I should be centering at the next lesson that I perhaps didn't know about. And I have students that do this in a variety of different forms. I have students that do a handwritten log with pencil and paper. I have students that do a shared document with me where they type it. I have students that are currently using an app called Andante where there's recorders. They can time their practice each session and write notes in there, and it exports to a sheet that they can share with me. Some of them just do a running document on their computer that they share. I've had students do a little note card for each week, and some of it can be as concise or as lengthy as is helpful for that student. I let them know that it should be a document that evolves as they move through their time with me and their time just working with a practice journal. Some of them do bullet points for each of these things. Some of them do full prose paragraphs. Really, it's for a tool for them, so I let it be as fluid and flexible as it needs to be for each student. The second is an idea of mental practice. I describe to my students that often when I'm getting ready to perform, right when I go to sleep, I sing through my pieces. I'm not singing actively. I'm not even necessarily moving my mouth to form the words, but I can hear the piano part, the interludes, my piece, all of my text in my head. And if there's any moment of what I call a fuzzy feeling where I don't know the next word, or if there's an instability of what the pitch is or a rhythm, that is where I start my practice the next day. So sitting and singing through music in your head mentally to think about what, especially in the service of memorization, how we can move from getting all of the things on the page into our head is a really great way to practice that doesn't require being in the practice room and doesn't require singing, but is a very effective method of practice. third that I've been trying this semester is paired practice. I have intentionally paired each of my students in my studio with another student and assigned weekly practice with a partner. So this is 1 hour a week of their practice where I give them options. They could grab coffee and sit next to each other and listen to their hour lesson together and then talk about it. They could get together in a practice room and they could sing some of the repertoire for each other, and they can give each other feedback. And with the other person holding the score, perhaps they're checking memorization, checking accuracy, giving feedback on nonverbal cues, their facial expressions, posture, what they see that the student might not be aware of, so the other student can really be a mirror. I've suggested that students warm up together, or perhaps one person is playing piano and the other is not, depending on their piano skills. For my popular voice students, I've assigned oral skills exercises such as harmonizing with each other or tonal memory. So they'll harmonize with each other in specific patterns and thirds and switch roles. And another reason for this paired practice for me personally is to build community within my studio and also collaboration between students. The idea of practicing individually in isolation can sometimes lead to feeling loneliness. And I think if we can find ways to make practice a more social, community building, collaborative event, perhaps it will be something that students are more motivated to do, and they can build relationships with students in the studio that they perhaps didn't have. And I've been intentional in my studio this semester of making sure that each of the students that are paired together have similar goals, whether that be their degree program, their learning development stage, their repertoire, any of these things. And this paired practice reflection also then goes into their practice journal. So I do ask them about it in their lesson, and it also goes into their practice journal. And I've witnessed some really wonderful effects of this paired practice, whether that be in practicing more because there's accountability to another person, but also just some joyous encounters between my students and some real friendship building. And then the last practice method is a practice plan. So this is an outline with specific goals that is written down for a student, and that could be, I had a piano teacher growing up that would bullet point give me specific things to practice. And this is not to put the responsibility or extra work onto a teacher. I think it's even better and more effective when it's coming from a student. So going into a practice session and saying, I want to specifically look at measures 15 to 27 with checking Italian diction, ensuring that I'm breathing at the end of the phrase and not in the middle of a word. And then these particular warm-ups, I want to do a complete run of my French melody and check memorization. Those 3 targeted things. And at the end of the practice session, they can determine, was I able to complete each of these things successfully? And if not, it goes on to the plan for the next day. And similarly to the practice journal, it can be as detailed or concise as is helpful to the student. And it can be something that a student just attempts and engages with, and as they spend more time with it, their methods can change. But having a specific goal for practice helps frame and keep that attention as attentive as possible and specific, so that the time can feel productive, rather than I go into a practice space and I come out 45 minutes later and I'm not really sure what happened in there. And finally, I have 10 quick tips for practice, and feel free to use these and share them with your students. Hopefully they are helpful to you and to your students in their practice. So practice tip 1, don't practice at a time of day when your brain is not conducive to learning. I often ask my students, are you a morning person, a night owl? Say they're a night owl. Perhaps 8 a.m. in the morning is not the best time for them to be learning and practicing, even though maybe that's when they have time in their schedule. Carving out time that matches with a time of day that your brain is ready to be worked is a really important thing for students to know and to match up with their schedule, to be very, very purposeful about how they spend their time. 2, create a practice space without distractions. Turn notifications off. Any dinging, any notification that would take you out of your specific attention space is going to be damaging. So turning off devices. A lot of practice rooms, for example, have windows. Trying to face your way, that you're not looking at a window and you're not getting distracted by people walking by or someone that might be waving at you, and thinking about what you need to be focused and without distraction. 3rd, which leads to breaking your practice session into smaller sections with breaks. I often suggest to my students, take a water break, take a walk in the middle of your practice. Often is really difficult to do longer than a perhaps 45-minute stint of focused practice. And I hear from students that they'll practice for 4 hours at a time. And I wonder how effective that is if they're just really just sitting in a room and calling it practice and repeating their repertoire over and over. So I suggest breaking your practice session into smaller sections with breaks. Say a student has 15 minutes at the beginning of their day and later they have 30, and then at the end of the day they have another 30. Maybe 15 minutes at the beginning of their day is a body warm-up, check-in, vocal health check-in, and then later 30 minutes is spent doing 15 minutes of warm-up, 15 minutes of deliberate practice on checking accuracy or learning a new section of a piece. And then 30 minutes later in the day, they can check whether they retained that learning or if they need to go back and rehash any of those things. 4th, change your focus while you practice. So allow yourself to jump between specific elements while you're practicing. I often equate our brain as singers as a 25-lane highway, and I would love for my students to feel like they're on a 1-lane dirt road in the middle of the country where it's quiet and not overwhelming. So allow yourself to focus on one thing at a time. So whether that be, I'm going to focus on my tongue, I'm going to focus on my ribcage expansion, I'm going to focus on expression. Allow those things to change throughout your practice, but really focus on one at a time. 5th, recording your practice. Now, I know a lot of people and students find this cringy, but it's really only for you. So allowing yourself to check in with a recording at the end of your practice allows you to have a little bit of that external feedback that you would get from your teacher. So say at the end of your practice session, you record a complete performance run of the piece that you're working on, and then you listen to it. Did all of the things happen that you were hoping to happen? Was everything accurate? Was it expressive? Did you say a different word? Did you change something without you being aware? It can increase self-awareness, and then you can save it or delete it. No one has to hear it except for you, but you can really be your own best helper by being aware of what's happening in your practice by recording. Number 6, work with a mirror or your phone on self-facing view if you don't have a mirror. Allowing yourself to see visually what is happening on your face, in your body, in your gesture can also give you some feedback. I often find that students have no idea that perhaps they're tilting their head a certain way, they're favoring a certain side of their body, they're moving their hands in a fidgety way that doesn't lead to expression, and they don't know. So again, a mirror or your phone on self-facing view can be that external feedback so that your teacher doesn't have to tell you, you already know. Number 7, if you have a major success, jump to another spot to try to recreate that success. For example, if you are struggling with a high note in one piece, but it's coming out beautifully, the same exact pitch, in a different piece, go to that successful place and try to establish what is going well. Working from success and then trying to apply it rather than doing the same the same thing over and over really is the definition of insanity. So really go to the spaces that you are successful and try to recreate success. Number 8, allowing your brain to focus on one goal at a time in number 4. Really, this quick tip is perhaps dated, but an idea of Post-its, putting something, one word cue, a mental cue on your wall, what you're looking at, or on your score, or on your computer, or on your iPad, to give you a reinforced cue of what to think about next, so that you're not trying to juggle all these different things. It's one word or one phrase on a Post-it or in bold, in a color, so that your brain is easily called to it, so that you can focus on one thing at a time. Number 9, that idea of mental practice. Practice does not always have to include singing. I consider my students listening to their lesson, score study, listening to examples, mental practice. All of those things are effective practice that doesn't have to include singing. So singing doesn't have to occur in the presence of a piano. It doesn't have to occur in a practice room, which means that your practice space could mean a lot of different things. And then the last one, have a plan with clear goals, all in service of feeling that that time is well spent and productive, and that your attention is as focused, engaged, and specific as possible. And typically, it can feel a lot less overwhelming, because if you can distill your practice plan into 3 to 5 attainable things, it's not, oh, I have to learn 8 different pieces for my jury. It feels much more attainable, rather than a huge swath of music that you're somehow supposed to learn in a small amount of time. So this is my bibliography. And lastly, my contact information. That's my UNCG email, my website if you want to learn more about me. And lastly, if you're interested in motor learning and this work, I had an article published in the May-June edition of last year's Journal of Singing, The Composition of a Voice Lesson, How a Motor Learning Classification Framework Affects Teacher Effectiveness. If you would like to learn more, please reach out. I would love to talk to any of you about any of these concepts, and I hope some of the ideas, concepts, and tools from this workshop are helpful and shed some new light on practice and how we can help our students feel more successful and deliberate in their practice on their own. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you have a wonderful time at the conference.